Hi everyone. A little while ago, I made a video with the sole purpose of highlighting a traditional Catholic teaching that I subjectively found to be disgusting. That video was on the fewness of the saved, a teaching that you'll often hear in traditionalist circles, sometimes from the pulpit at FSSP or SSPX masses. That was a humble video in as much as I didn't really offer any counter arguments. All I did was display something that some trads believe, and that's it. Today, I aim to do something similar. But instead of talking about the fewness of the saved, I will be highlighting another particularly disgusting thing that you'll sometimes hear in trad circles. This one actually being a take from St. Thomas Aquinas about sins of lust. In particular, I will highlight which sins of lust Aquinas thinks are worse than others. If you're only passingly familiar with Aquinas, you may be shocked to hear what he has to say about the severity of some sins of lust in relation to others. Let's talk about it. For today's discussion, I will be reading from the Summa, second part of the second part, question 154, the parts of lust, and from Articles 11 and particularly from Article 12 as part of question 154. In an effort to not anger the gods of the YouTube algorithm, I will not be saying most of the words that are rather necessary. At least I won't be saying them in English. Instead, I will refer to some things using vague English language, but you'll understand what I mean. And for one word, I'm actually only going to say that word in Latin. That Latin word is raptus. That's a noun from the Latin verb rapere, which means literally to seize. You could see it here, septimo de raptu. And raptu and raptus are the same word if you're not familiar with how nouns work in Latin. And you could see here, septimo is the number 7. So that is what raptu means right there. Again, won't be saying the word, but I will be referring to the sin of raptus throughout the course of this video, and you know what I'm referring to now when I talk about the sin of raptus. I'll also not be saying any words that Aquinas would use under number 11, the sins against nature, or in Latin, you could see that here, undecimo de peccato contra naturam. So that's just unnatural vices is often how that phrase is translated. Vices against nature or just unnatural vices. I'm going to be referring to solo acts, and when I say solo acts, that is generally what Aquinas is referring to, among other things, when he talks about unnatural vices. Now, I just said that the solo act is included in unnatural vices, but that's not everything that unnatural vices includes. So let's read from Article 11, now only reading in English, to see what Aquinas includes as part of the unnatural vices. So Aquinas, as I answer that, and go ahead and read the full thing, and this is called the unnatural vice. This may happen in several ways. So there are several different ways, in fact, in which somebody can sin using unnatural vice. First, by procuring pollution. Pollution is Aquinas. If you've ever listened to Sensus Fidelium, you know what pollution is. By procuring pollution without copulation for the sake of venereal pleasure. This is the solo act. This pertains to the sin of uncleanliness, which some call effeminacy. It's medieval language. It's weird. So that's the first one. The first one of the 4 is solo acts. Secondly, by copulation with a thing of undue species. This is called bestiality. Okay, so solo acts and bestiality are both considered part of the same category of unnatural vices. Third, by copulation with an undue sex, male with male or female with female. As the apostle states, this is called the vice of sodomy, referring to Romans 1:27 there. So again, just LGBT acts with non-human animals and solo acts are 3 of the 4. And then the 4th of the 4 is just fourthly, by not observing the natural manner of copulation, either as to undue means or as to other monstrous and beastly manners of copulation. Now, Aquinas, I'm not entirely sure that this is correct, but the way that I read that is he's not talking about having relations with non-human animals here, even though he uses the word bestial and monstrous. He covers that in number 2 of 4. Number 4 of 4, I believe, is just any kind of act that involves contraception. And not only contraception through like artificial or chemical means, but also just any kind of act that like would involve like a mouth, perhaps, instead of only using the organs that are involved in the procreative process. I believe that would be included as well under number 4 of 4 in the unnatural vices. That was from Article 11. Now let's read from Article 12, whether the unnatural vice is the greatest sin among the species of lust. So in this article, Aquinas is essentially answering the question, what is worse, raptus or unnatural vice, which again includes something seemingly as benign as solo acts. Okay. Objection 1. It would seem that the unnatural vice is not the greatest sin among the species of lust. For the more a sin is contrary to charity, the graver it is. Now, adultery, seduction, and raptus, which are injurious to our neighbor, are seemingly more contrary to the love of our neighbor than unnatural sins by which no other person is injured. Therefore, the unnatural sin is not the greatest among the species of lust. I think that most people in a modern audience would read this and say, yeah, I mean, that all checks out to me. The unnatural vices, which include things like consensual LGBT relations, as well as solo acts, that's not as bad as raptus, because raptus is also a sin against charity, as well as a sin against lust. But if you recall how the Summa works, Aquinas starts off by trying to, I guess, like steelman the opposition. Aquinas quickly lays out a few more objections, and then he knocks them down. Aquinas does not agree with objection 1, and I know that objection 1 sounds correct. I think we should keep reading, because in the part that starts with on the contrary and then I answer that, this is where Thomas knocks down the argument that raptus is worse than a solo act. Indeed, Aquinas goes on to argue that raptus is not as immoral as a solo act. And I know that that sounds repulsive to any modern listener, but let's read Aquinas and see why he makes that argument. On the contrary, Augustine says that of all of these, namely the sins of lust, that which is against nature is the worst. So Aquinas is relying on St. Augustine here, saying that indeed the unnatural vices are worse than raptus. The solo act is worse than raptus. He doesn't only rely on Augustine, though. He goes on, I answer that in every genus, worst of all is the corruption of the principle on which the rest depend. Now, the principles of reason are these things that are according to nature, because reason presupposes things as determined by nature, before disposing of other things according as it is fitting. This may be observed both in speculative and in practical matters. Wherefore, just as in speculative matters, the most grievous and shameful error is that which is about the things, the knowledge of which is naturally bestowed upon man. So, in matters of action, it is the most grave and shameful to act against things as determined by nature. Therefore, since the unnatural vices man transgresses that which has been determined by nature with regard to the use of the venereal actions, it follows that in this matter, this sin is the gravest of all. After it comes acts with people that you are related to, which, as stated above in Article 9, is contrary to the natural respect which we owe to persons related to us. With regard to the other species of lust, they imply a transgression merely of that which is determined by right reason, on the presupposition, however, of natural principles. Now, it is more against reason to make use of the venereal act not only with prejudice to future offspring, but also so as to injure another person besides. Wherefore, simple fornication is committed without injustice to another person. It is the least grave among the species of lust. Okay, so Aquinas says that like two unmarried people doing acts together without any kind of coercion is the least immoral sin of lust. I'm not really going to fight him on that one. Frankly, I'm not going to fight him on any of these because it's just not my place. I'm not Catholic. I can just simply say, yeah, that sounds wrong to me at the face of it, and that's it. But if you are a Catholic, and in particular if you're a Thomist, you know, I guess you have to wrestle with this kind of stuff. More on that later. Then it is a greater injustice to have intercourse with a woman who is subject to another's authority as regards the act of generation than as regards merely her guardianship. Wherefore, adultery is more grievous than seduction. And both of these are aggravated by the use of violence. Hence, raptus of a virgin is greater than seduction, and raptus of a wife than adultery. And all of these are aggravated by coming under the head of sacrilege, as stated above. So again, just an interesting note that Aquinas thinks that raptus against a virgin is actually worse than raptus of a non-virgin, as if a woman's worth is somewhat determined by her virginity. So in case the kind of weird language which is an artifact of just the translation of Aquinas from Latin into English makes any of that unclear, Aquinas holds that a solo marital act is worse than a raptus. He says that this is because the solo act is against nature, while raptus is not against nature. The solo act, he doesn't explicitly say this, but it frustrates the end of the act, while a raptus does not frustrate the end of the act. And to be clear, Aquinas talks about solo acts, acts with animals, acts between people of the same gender, and just any contraceptive act, all in the same breath. So all four of those, he says, are worse than raptus. To almost anyone in the modern day, that will sound like a particularly disgusting moral take. I mean, just lumping the three sins of solo acts, LGBT acts, and contraceptive acts alongside the fourth one in that same category, acts with non-human animals, just lumping them all into the same category would probably strike most modern people as at least deeply confused, if not just very offensive and wrong, let alone saying that those things are all worse than raptus. But that's not uncommon to hear in certain trad spaces. Though I generally think that the stuff that you hear in trad spaces is more about how LGBT acts are worse than raptus, because at least raptus can end with procreation. More importantly, I'm not sure that any Catholic could be confident that Aquinas is wrong, that the solo act is worse than raptus, if that modern Catholic believes that morality is teleological in nature, as Aquinas did. Sure, deny that morality is teleological in nature, and Aquinas is wrong on this regard. Easy. But if Aquinas' belief that morality is teleological in nature is correct, then maybe Aquinas' point here stands. This is one of my critiques about morality being teleological in nature. I don't think that morality, if it did exist, would operate in this way. When I see this, natural law really only seems to me to say that something is good at something. Sure, the four unnatural vices are worse than raptus for procreation. Raptus very well may end up in creating a new human life. The unnatural vices will not. Great. But is that morality? If I believed in morality, I would believe that that is not what morality is. Under a realist perspective, we could say that the essence, the nature, or the substance of a burglar, for instance, is to steal things. We can compare a famous burglar, like Bilbo Baggins, for instance, to the ideal burglar, and then we can assess how good at being a burglar Bilbo Baggins is. But to insist that this same principle applies for morality strikes me as an odd one. I cannot understand for the life of me why being bad for procreating makes something immoral. But if we do make this presupposition, or at least if we do make this supposition, then I see where Aquinas' thinking makes sense. Sexually speaking, the unnatural vices are indeed worse than raptus. For procreation, anyway, but under Aquinas' understanding, that makes it objectively worse under his objective moral system. I bet that this makes most modern thinkers pretty uncomfortable. Unless it just sounds so ridiculous that it doesn't make you uncomfortable because this is just laughable. To be honest, the more time that I spend outside of the trad church, the more alien this kind of thinking becomes to me. I used to have the intuition that Aquinas would have been right here, but today I just don't have that intuition. Like, that intuition kind of just dried up, I guess, over time. And I think that most people, at least most people who didn't grow up trad, probably also lack the intuition that morality is teleological in nature. And if you do lack that intuition, then I feel like the take that Raptus is not as bad as the solo act is going to be a really hard sell. Hey, are you a Thomist? Do you, as a Thomist, think that Aquinas was right or wrong here? I'm particularly interested to hear from the Thomists in the comment section down below. And I guess I'm just also interested to hear all the other Catholics and ex-Catholics and non-Catholics altogether. Were you surprised to hear that Aquinas taught in the Summa that raptus isn't as bad of a sin as a solo act? I think this probably does surprise a whole lot of people, so I look forward to hearing from you in the comment section down below. Thanks, everybody.